Thank you. Uh, so we'll get that done, and then let's go to the regularly scheduled lecture here. So where we ended up yesterday was looking at the origin of laws, and we know that we have our first codification or legal code is really, really old, right? So we're looking at over 2,000 years ago. They're writing laws down and putting them in public so people can see what the laws are. That's a little better than the way we do it. We write laws and then nobody knows what the laws are, right? They pass laws all the time. We don't have a nice list, as you walk down the hall, you can say, hey, here's all the laws you should follow as a student. We just don't have that. So this idea of writing laws and publicly posting them is probably a good idea, but nevertheless, it's not something we do now. But by the same token, even those laws were probably 1,000 years or more older than when they were actually written down. Some of our laws even go back, well, even further than that. Abraham was an interesting person in history. He was the first successful monotheist, meaning one God, right? In a world of polytheism and paganism and so on, he had a different take on it. There's one God and that's it, right? And also too, there's some dramatic stories around his family, whatever. He had, they were polygamous too, so he had a couple of family members, and one was going to give birth to the Arab race and the other is going to give birth to the Hebrew race and the Jewish race. So right there in that family, two of the great cultures in the Middle East will be born. Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac, of course, at one point was going to be sacrificed on an altar. That's probably not a good thing. And that's, And so this was stopped though. And animals were exchanged for human sacrifice. Now that's probably a good change, don't you think? And so that was a very important moment. We're not going to do, in some places, they were doing human sacrifice. Look at the Aztecs doing it right up until 1495. No, wait a minute, 1520. So that's a bad thing. And so that ended that kind of practice. And also too, there were lots of reforms that came in as a result of Abraham. And Abraham is a prophet to three sister religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all related to this root. In fact, all three of these religions share more in common in terms of their beliefs and legal code and whatever than differences. The differences are really magnified, but they kind of started in the same place. One of those places they all start is with the Ten Commandments. Now, if you know any of this Bible stuff, and I got chewed out by one grandma, you're teaching religion, and excuse me, I'm not. I'm teaching law and history. And what history do we have? What laws can we talk about if we have to leave religion out? It doesn't exist. There is no ancient, classical, medieval history, and much of modern history has a lot to do with changes in religion and movements of religious groups. Very important to our understanding of laws. Are there religious groups today that are very influential in the laws of the United States? Of course. Here's one phrase I want you to memorize. There might be a separation of church and state, but there is not a separation of church and politics. Those are two very different things. I'll unravel that later in another lecture. But one of the roots and one of the groups of laws that we still use today came from when Moses, Jewish people, Hebrews, were captives of the Egyptians for a long time. And when they had their exodus or their big escape, like we just saw an exodus out of Afghanistan, this big exodus put them as wandering nomadic peoples for 40 years. But one of the things that came out of that was Moses going to the mountain and getting from God the 10 Commandments, which is kind of bedrock legal code for the Jewish people. And Jesus was a Jew. He grew up with these laws, grew up with these traditions. Muhammad, in the area he lived, there were both Christians and Jews all around him, and he learned from them. And Abraham, of course, became very important, and so did Moses. They were all, and Jesus were all considered prophets to Muhammad. So these three religions have much more in common than they ever have in terms of differences. And one is the 10 Commandments. Like, don't kill people. Duh. Don't steal stuff. Okay. Honor thy father and thy mother. Sometimes you guys don't really do that. You should. In Hammurabi's world, what happened if you tried to punch your dad in the eye? Yeah, not a good thing. But they had respect for older people in different cultures. But one guy wrote a book, and he went through and he said, okay, so here's what happens. You just kind of start with the 10 Commandments, but then the Jewish folks, as they were once again held captive now by the Babylonians, so they would have lived under Hammurabi's code. The only reason they survived as an independent group and just didn't meld in as slaves in that society was that they had their own written records, and so they could go back and define who they were in the absence of having a temple in a city-state. So this was a really big deal. And so they started to create a lot of their own laws too, that governed their little community there in Babylon. And the list grew and grew and grew. And if you're a rabbi, you study these large amounts of text. It's not just the Old Testament. Old Testament is just a fraction of what is in Jewish tradition scripturally. And he went through all of that, and he wrote a book, and he did 72 pages of a notebook, 26, lines per thing, 26 pages of all the laws you'd have to follow if you were living in that time period. Obviously, the 10 Commandments, love thy neighbor, be fruitful, multiply. And here's some. Do not wear clothes of mixed fibers. Okay, so how many of you have a polyester cotton blend on? Okay, oops, violation of the law. For some reason or other, they didn't want to mix those fibers like goat and sheep, wool and that kind of stuff. Don't know why, but also there was a prohibition against shaving your beard. You look at the Taliban and they all got beards on. Why? It's a religious thing. It looks to me like they can trim it, but here's the thing. The Jewish folks would have started that tradition in terms of, like, for example, when you look across the Jewish tradition, there's conservative Orthodox, and then there's, people that are just Jewish by nationality. And they practice, a rainbow of practice from more what they would call more liberal to more conservative. And if you're a conservative Hasidic Jew, for example, living in Jerusalem, you grow these ringlets, right? And you wear your hair in a certain, you always have your hair covered, and then you have these prayer boxes. And I got lucky once. I was at an airport, waiting to head to a triathlon, and I was a long layover in New York, and it was the transit point to go to Israel, to go to the Wailing Wall, I suppose. But a group of Jewish practitioners found a little isolated spot in the airport to do their prayers. And I was the only one sitting over there with my little computer, and I'm going like this, looking at my computer going, it was breathtakingly cool. Not something that, you'd get to see very often. And I'm going, wow. And I got a whole new appreciation of 3,000, 4,000 years of practice of a religion, right? So don't shame it. Now, here's one: stoning adulterers, okay? That still happens in some very remote places in the world, sadly. But by the same token, Jesus comes along, right? Kind of changed that practice, right? They were going to stone somebody. And he said, no. Ye who are without fault, cast the first stone. You might have heard something similar to that. So maybe that practice should go away too. And so that was fascinating. And one of the other things too was the amazing number of dietary restrictions. Now raise your hand if you know of any religion or church that has dietary restrictions, right? Okay, let's go through. What are some of the Jewish dietary restrictions? Yes.
That you cannot mix beef with milk.
Yeah. Plus, you can't eat what? Go ahead.
I think I know like two things. You can't eat anything like a cloven hoof or something.
Yeah. They big on pork. Yeah, that's right, right. Neither are the Muslims. In fact, when we invaded Afghanistan 20 years ago, there was one pig in the entire country, one, and he was in the zoo. Dietary restrictions. Once we went on a field trip, right? We weren't thinking. We had a Muslim kid in that class, a great kid. Man, we ordered ham sandwiches for everybody. Wow, big mistake. Run down to Kentucky Fried Chicken, got some chicken, brought it up quickly, but that was embarrassing. We should have known better, right? And we didn't, but we fixed it. But by the same token, some of these things sound a little weird to us, but maybe back then there were reasons not to, right? So maybe it was just born out of experience, who knows? But in terms of like the day of rest, some of the rules are really strict as to what you can and can't do on what they would call the Sabbath. And a lot of those things carried over. But these were laws you had to live by. And they were religious in origin. And it's quite an interesting book that this guy wrote. And a lot of these laws seep into Christian law and to Islamic law too. One of them they all shared in common early on was this idea of usury. Usury is an interesting word. It means charging interest. So I give you $100 and you promise to pay me $110, right, next week. So I've just made $10 and I get my $100 back, right? Okay. But I did no work for that $10. I physically didn't do anything. I just handed you my wealth and you give me more wealth back without me actually contributing to earning any more. That was banned in all three of these religions for a time. Now, since that time period, Christians now, they have banks and loans and Jewish community banks and loans. But in the Islamic world, they still hold to usury. So getting a car financed or a home financed from a Muslim bank is a very different process. So you can still obey the law and everybody can still benefit. And so Muslim banking is very different in the Middle East than banking, say, in London or in New York. But that's one where a couple of groups have drifted away from that law, as opposed to those that say that's a no-no. That's just an example. And so we discount the role of religion in our laws. A lot of the laws we live by were started because there was no separation of church and state. The idea of separating church and state is very modern. It was theorized in the Enlightenment in France and to some degree England, and then actually operationalized by Thomas Jefferson in Virginia only at first, and then became part of our First Amendment as a solution to the problem in America was that we had lots of different contending religions. So how could you pick one to be the national church? You couldn't. And so he came up with a novel solution, which I would hope would spread across the world. But as we explained yesterday, how many countries in the world are still theocracies or tremendously guided by religious leaders? And the Taliban is just the most recent example. So it becomes important when we study the history of laws. Now we get to another group, though, that did something completely different. These were the pagan, disorganized, and oh, by the way, just kind of really out there Greeks. So another source of our laws are these guys who are going to heavily influence the Romans, right? Now, here's the thing. Greek history is different than, say, the history of Mesopotamia, land between two rivers, or Egypt with the Nile, the river civilizations of the Indus and the Chinese. This didn't have river systems. What is the most prominent feature of the area we now call Greece? Yeah. Do you realize nearly every person in Greece, nearly everyone, lives within 20 miles of the sea? So these inlets, these islands, these peninsulas, all of this plays a big role. Plus, it's a very rocky, craggy place. So valleys, there's lots of valleys and stuff that are hard to get to. So when the Dorians invaded, the original Greeks came in and took over this area. They practiced agriculture too. I mean, agriculture spread, But you could only grow so much in these mountain valleys before the population would get too big. And then what you would do is the grandparents and the parents would send their kids on a boat and say, hey, go find another colony. They had to. And so the Greeks spread out throughout the Aegean Sea. They would settle in the southern part of Italy. They would settle as far away as France. They settled the Black Sea because they had to, because the agriculture in one particular pocket was not enough to support a growing population. So they had to move out. Vikings, the same way, by the way. But where they are settled, it's called a polis, which is the origin of our word politics. Now, here's the deal. A polis is just a city-state, like Babylon was a city-state, and then they took other little city-states over, that kind of thing. Greece had all these different city-states. A polis is a political, economic, or cultural unity in an urban area, right? So you have a little city surrounded by all the agricultural villages going around it. So it's harder to see in Utah County. When I first started teaching here all those decades ago, there was a big separation between Spanish Fork, Springville, agricultural land between that and Provo, all the way on up. You could see they were separate cities. So I said, okay, so you have Linden and you have Orem, all city states, and they all keep contending against each other, fighting each other. I read in one book that the Greeks loved to fight each other with gladness. They were a warrior culture. They moved into these craggy areas, established little city states, and they became fiercely independent of each other. Do not think for a minute that Greece was a unified place. It was not. The idea of Greece today is a modern invention since World War I. It was never, in the old world, anything but a bunch of contending little city states. Now, here's the thing. They were small, between 1,000 and 3,000 square miles. Here's the way I think you can visualize it now. Park City is a city state, and all the hinterland is a German word. All the hinterland feeds into Park City, right? But then you have the Heberians up in Heber, next to the Midwayans. And then you have the Provo-Oremites down here. And they would all be fighting each other with gladness. So these pockets of civilization, all called a polis. Now, the beauty of it for later Greeks in Athens, like Plato, is that this offered them a laboratory of different types of governments, literally hundreds of them, where different Greek city-states were practicing government in a different way. And I've lost the attention of some. I don't know why you'd be on your computers. Let's shut them completely down. No need to take notes here because I'm recording this for posterity. If you need the notes, you can go back and listen to it at double speed and get to the notes. But these Greeks, right, were a laboratory of experimentation. You can't get a more diverse set of governments than Sparta, with its oppressive oligarchy and its military nature, as to later Athens. I mean, and they were only just you could run there in a day. So here we have these words. Now, words matter. The Greeks are going to be the ones that are going to define our political vocabulary, like polis, politics, right? Basically, politics. How do they make decisions in this city-state? What's the polis? What's the politics there? Most predominantly were tyrants. Now, instantly, you're sitting there saying to yourself, tyrant, oh, that's evil, unscrupulous dictator types. Nah, Greeks wouldn't have seen it that way. See, the Greeks weren't ascribing a moral value to a word. A word is just a description, a type, right? Tyrants, for them, would be capable rulers who could take power by their own means, usually with popular support. And they would have good tyrants and bad tyrants. I'm going to give you an example here in a minute of a really good tyrant and a really bad one in the same city-state. Tyrants were judged upon their merits. The word becomes unscrupulous dictators or oligarchs who usurp rights and practice tyranny only in modern times, thank you to Thomas Paine and Common Sense, that book that made King George III out to be a nasty tyrant. Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence spent most of that document talking about how evil the king was. By the way, all of that was propaganda and not true. If there was a more benevolent king on the planet at the time, it would have been George III. He was limited by Parliament. It was a limited monarchy. The people that helped us win our independence had a true autocratic leader, Louis the 16th of France. So we had an autocracy who didn't believe in any of this, helping us win our independence against the one empire on the planet that had a parliament and democracy, emerging democracy and whatever. But we had to call the king a tyrant because, see, here's the thing. It's easier to blame one person than it is to disparage a whole person. It's easy for us today to say Hitler was evil than to say all the German people were evil, right? We're not going to do that. Here, it's easy to say Biden is the problem, as opposed to we as Americans who kind of voted him all in. It's easy to blame George III for everything going on, even though he had very little to do with it. The people that passed the laws that the American revolutionaries, and by the way, it was only a minority of the population, the American revolutionaries were not the majority of the population, that they were objecting to were passed by Parliament, not the king. The navigation laws, the Stamp Act, that was Parliament. And the party in power were called the Tories. Now, here's the thing. In those days, if you were a revolutionary, guess what? You used the term Tory as a negative, derogatory statement for people who opposed the revolution. That Tory, as if that was some evil, terrible thing. Now, you guys aren't even reacting to the word Tory. Tory doesn't mean, another one was monarchist. You're a monarchist, Tory. How evil could you be? It'd be like today saying, you're a communist or a socialist or some sort of ist, a nationalist. Oh, or you're a liberal or you're a conservative. We throw these terms out as negative terms when in reality, the Tory was just a member of a political party who had control of England at the time and passed some laws that turned out to be kind of what we call draconian, that we rebelled to. Now, here's an interesting one. The opposition party in the parliament were called the Whigs. The Whigs did not want the American Revolution. They wanted, let's back off. Let's let them have a degree of home rule, which is, by the way, what England did with all the rest of its colonies after this at some point or another in history. And let's just trade with them and keep the business going and not pollute the relationship. The Whigs were the heroes. In fact, we later in history named one of our own political parties after the Whigs. And Tory became an evil word. Monarchist became an evil word. I'm still seeing in a lot of your essays, liberal, conservative, nationalist, whatever, being used as political terms. To mean something you assume is bad. But it's not. It's just a word. You have good tyrants and you have bad tyrants. You have, could there have been some good communists? Or were there some bad ones? Of course, Joseph Stalin, who really wasn't a communist, he was more of a thug and a crime boss. Here's where we get the example of tyrants. Now remember, words. We put too much power in a word, not really knowing what it means. 7th century BCE, in Athens, one of the city-states, there was social unrest. Now let me ask you a question. Is there social unrest in America today? A lot of it. They were facing the same problems. So the ruling class appointed a tyrant, Draco, to solve the social unrest. Here was his solution: a strict new legal code of laws. Let's get tough. To this day, we now call strict laws draconian laws. He earned himself a place in history. Crack down on the social unrest. Try to say, knock it off or you're going to pay. Did it work? Did it work? Would it work here? Give me some examples of draconian laws in American history that flat out didn't work. The people weren't going to go along with it. Go ahead. Prohibition is the first best case. We literally, and you guys need to know these amendments, we literally passed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution to prohibit the use of alcohol in this country. Did it work?
No.
What happened instead?
Did the reverse.
Alcohol consumption goes up. Crime organizations start to make huge profits. And oh, by the way, we couldn't tax alcohol anymore because it was illegal even to have. And so instead of taxing it like Alexander Hamilton did, a great source of revenue all the way through history, that source disappeared. And the purity of some of this, some of the alcohol being sold by the criminals could make you sick and even blind. This was a bad state of affairs. And then it turned violent. You guys heard of this St. Valentine's Day massacre and all that, where these crime organizations were fighting for turf. The thing about it is, when we got to the Great Depression, we needed a source of revenue and we had to stop the violence. So people who had even supported the 18th Amendment now said, we got to get rid of it. It didn't work. And this is the only time where we pass an amendment to overturn another amendment. 18th and 21st, you'll need to know that. Has there been a more recent example where we cracked down hard on something and it turned out, boy, that didn't work? And you can put your phone away because I don't know how that's going to help you with this discussion. Give me another example. In your life right now. Still debated. Yes. That's an interesting one, isn't it? If we got really draconian on it, I don't know the answer to that one, but I'll tell you what, I think you're onto something there. That'd make a good essay, wouldn't it? Give me another one. Yeah. This one's going to be as big of a story as we've ever had in the next session of the Supreme Court. We're going to see where that goes next semester. Give me another one though. Yeah.
Like a lot of different types of drugs because, like, you know, they're bad or whatever, but that it has the same issue as prohibition where like the criminals and stuff are making money off of it, and like that actually like are like getting the drugs are willing to like report it or turn it in. It's not good because then they'll get it caught. It's like this whole
President Nixon started a thing called the War on Drugs, that how we're going to cut drug use in America will be, we will arrest anybody that does drugs. We had more people incarcerated as a percentage of our population than any other country in the world. And did it stop drug use? But the criminality is unbelievable and it's brutal, isn't it? And so I think you're giving us another example. And guess what? Then Colorado just says, okay, marijuana, we're going to make it legal. They're now collecting taxes on it, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. They're growing marijuana for the rest of the country. In Utah, it's now legal for who? Medical. And there are some conditions that are definitely helped by that. But here's the thing. I want to say this before we get too carried away with this. I have friends who smoke marijuana every day of their lives in protest, risking going to jail every day of their lives, saying it was their protest. But here's what I also want to tell you. The person I'm thinking of right now is no longer with us. Heart disease got him. And that constant smoking made him ill. And he retired from this world maybe 20 years before he should have. So my advice to you is to be careful with what you take into your body. Vaping might turn out to be a very bad thing. As cigarettes, when I was a kid, hey, it was okay to smoke. No, boy. So my advice is to use your head. But now that it's legal, it's your choice. And so I would just hope, and this is an old guy talking like your grandpa, make the right choice. Make the right choice. Draco failed. He was ousted. And then they turned to another tyrant named Solon. So we get a bad tyrant and a good one. And this Solon took 10 years, rewrote the constitution. He took over during this year right here. And he wrote a new constitution and he laid out the foundation for the future of Athens. This was pretty crazy stuff. People, biggest number one social, their debts were so high. The landowners who owned the land, the rents were too high. the serfs working for them. They weren't able to ever get ahead. Some of these serfs and peasants even sold their children into slavery to pay their debts. That was a common practice, by the way, in certain parts of the ancient world. He canceled all the debts. What's your biggest number one issue that you guys talked about in terms of education? Student loans. Is Biden going to be the president that says, hey, let's give everybody 2 years of college for free and reducing that pressure on y'all? And then here's the thing. Not only can, and by the way, this happened in the ancient world quite a bit, where a new ruler come in, cancel all the debts, everybody start fresh, start over. He released the peasants from serfdom. He was the Abraham Lincoln of Athens. A lot of these peasants and serfs went out onto the craggy rocks and things around and started to plant olive trees, which is going to make a huge difference, as we're going to learn tomorrow, into the future economy. They still worked for the landowner, but now they were getting paid for it. Then he took those that were sold into slavery outside of Athens and he bought their freedom back, bringing kids home that had been sold into slavery. That's pretty epic. And then he granted citizenship to anybody who had skills who wanted to come to Athens and contribute to the economy of Athens. That was a game changer. And in our country, one of the big things in software is we take somebody to Stanford University, train them as a top flight engineer, and yet guess what? They go home to India because we don't have a visa system that will allow them to stay and work here. Do we want to train that talent and have it go to India and compete against us? So the software industry is saying, very vocally, we want to keep as many of these people here to help us compete instead of releasing our biggest competition. So this was huge. And the foundations laid by Solon are going to transform this city-state into a powerhouse economically. So good tyrant and what? Bad tyrant. And don't forget the word draconian. Use it a lot. It's a great word. Okay. And also the Solon becoming this reformer. Wow. Okay. So we're going to pause right there, and we'll take this story a little bit further tomorrow.